Brian Goulet, the Goulet Pen Company and Ink Nouveau. This Fountain Pen 101 is talking about flying with fountain pens. I've been asked this quite a bit, and it's kind of a common myth of flying with a fountain pen is like flying with an ink bomb in your pocket. And there's some element of truth to the leakage potential when you're flying with a fountain pen, but it's not probably as drastic as you may have an impression that it is. So let me explain to you what's happening when you're flying. Let's assume that you're at ground level when you're about to take off. Well, the way the planes work is between about, ground level and maybe 6,000 foot elevation. The pressure differential inside the cabin is the same as whatever it is outside the cabin. So if you're at, ground level, it's ground level air pressure. As you're taking off and you're going up, as you hit 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 feet, the pressure is decreasing from what it was at ground level. So when you hit about 6,000 feet, then in order to keep it comfortable inside the plane, they pressurize the cabin to maintain somewhere about 6,000 feet. So as you go higher up to 10, 15, 20,000, you're still at about the same pressure of 6,000 feet. Does that make sense? So if you're taking off from an area like, Denver, Colorado, where it's a mile high up, the difference isn't going to be that great because the cabin's still going to be pressurized to about 6,000 feet. But if you're coming from, sea level, then it's going to be, quite a difference between what you are when you're on the tarmac and what you are when you're actually in flight. So what's happening with a fountain pen is any change in pressure that you have is going to be affected by your surrounding environment. So as let's say you're at sea level. Well, if you have any air inside your pen, like I have here, then as you're going up, the air inside of your pen wants to equalize with the surrounding environment. Does that make sense? So if you're at ground level, you fill your pen at ground level, you have air in your pen at ground level pressure, as you're going up, then the pressure in the surrounding environment is decreasing, right? But the pressure inside the pen is still where you filled it at sea level, right? That's assuming we're starting at sea level. So the pressure inside the pen wants to equalize, and the only direction that this air can go to get outside of the pen is through the nib and the feed. Well, what happens is if you have ink that's separating the air inside your pen and the nib and the feed where the air needs to escape, guess what's going to happen? That air is going to push the ink through the nib and the feed, and you're going to have a leak. So, rule number one when you're flying with a fountain pen is to make sure that you have as little air as possible inside your pen. And if you really want to be sure, just have your pen clean and empty, and don't even fly with ink in it. If you want to be absolutely sure, you don't want to have a leak. But if you do want to have it, make sure that you have as little air as possible. Now, if you're using an eyedropper converted pen, that's your biggest risk because that has the greatest volume of ink and the greatest volume potentially of air. And also, when you have an eyedropper pen, there's no way to get the air out of the pen other than just filling it up with more ink. If you have a piston fill pen like this Noodler's Conrad here, if you have a large cavity of air inside the pen, you could just fill it up with more ink and then there would be less air in there to want to equalize. Or what you can do is you can twist the piston so that you're getting the air out of the pen, like so. And then you've only got ink inside the chamber and no air. The less air you have, the less likely you already have a leak. Okay, but say that none of that's an option for you. What you want to do is you want to try to fly keeping your pens with the nibs stored up. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow the air to stay up near the nib and the feed so that when the pressure wants to equalize inside the pen, it comes right out of there and your ink is down here, minimizes the potential for a leak. There's still going to be a little bit of ink down in the feed, because when you're using it, ink is going in the feed. That's kind of how it works. But it's not going to be a huge volume. So you may get a little bit of ink that'll kind of end up in your cap, but it's not going to be a massive leak or anything like that. So that is going to be the best way to go. And then the most potential for a leak is happening from the time that you're on the tarmac and you're taking off till you hit about 6,000 feet. Because once you hit 6,000, the pressure is going to stay about the same in the environment. So you want to make absolutely sure, if nothing else, that you aren't writing with your pen during takeoff or shortly after takeoff. Because until you hit 6,000 feet, that's when you're going to have the greatest variance in pressure change. That's when you're going to have the most drastic pressure drop in the surrounding environment while you're using your pen. And if you're, like I mentioned before, if you got air in between the feed and, or if you got ink, sorry, between the feed and the air, it's going to want to burp out of your pen. So, if nothing else, keep the air out. Fill it up with as much ink as you can if you are going to be flying with an inked up pen. Keep the nib pointed up and don't use your pen during takeoff. And that's pretty much going to keep you in the safe zone as far as using a fountain pen or taking a fountain pen while you're flying. It's not as big a deal while you're descending, because if you think about it, the pressure in the surrounding environment is increasing as you're descending, and so it wants to force pressure into the pen instead of out of it. So the potential for a leak is not nearly what it is descending as it is ascending. And probably the other thing you're wondering is, what about ink? If you're flying with ink, it doesn't particularly matter whether it's stored in your checked bags or carry-on, because it's all pressurized. But the ink, if you think about the same kind of thing, if you've got a bottle, let's say it's half filled with ink, I mean, you don't always have the option to fill your bottle all the way. So there's going to be air inside your bottle. But your bottle is sealed. There's no air escaping. You want to make sure your bottle is well sealed. That's kind of just a given. But if you've got a bottle of ink with some air in it, as you go up, the pressure inside the bottle is going to be greater than the surrounding environment. You just can't get away from that. But assuming you're flying up and then you're flying back down, then unless you're going to be flying to somewhere, a destination that is a much higher elevation than where you're coming from, the pressure inside the bottle as you fly up will be higher than the surrounding environment, but then as soon as you go back down, it's going to be the same as it was when you took off. So then you can unscrew it and it's not a big deal. If you are flying to somewhere which is a much higher elevation, the pressure inside the bottle is going to be greater, but when you unscrew it, all the air is going to be at the top of the bottle anyway. So it equalizes very easily. You may get a little bit of ink, on the threads or something like that, but it's really not so much an issue. I think the bigger risk of leakage when you're flying with a bottle of ink is the baggage handlers and how they're going to throw your bags around and the ink bottle actually breaking due to physical damage. That's probably something you should be more worried about when you're flying with a bottle of ink. So make sure it's well padded. Maybe put it in a Ziploc snack bag or something like that. You can do the same thing with your pen if you're really worried about a leak. Put it in a snack bag, and that, even if you have a massive leak, it'll be contained in the pen. So hopefully that's helpful to you. If you have any questions, you can always post in the comments or shoot me an email at brian@gouletpens.com. Thanks so much for watching, and ride on.